different way.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Untokening Transformative Talk series, a collaborative virtual space where community experts come together to connect, share, and uplift. The Untokening is a multiracial collective that centers the lived experiences of marginalized communities to address mobility, justice, and equity. So you can visit untokening.org to learn more. The next Untokening convening will be in Durham, North Carolina, October 5th through 6th. So you can check that out now on the website. Transformative Talks is produced from Los Angeles by social justice planner Monique López of Pueblo, with support from People for Mobility Justice Building Power Director Río Oxas, which is me, and Mobility Justice Strategist Adonia Lugo, who wears 3 hats as a collaborator with Pueblo, PMJ, and Untokening. We're also broadcasting on Facebook Live, and we'll make this recording available after today's webinar. Also, if everybody can see the Q&A function in the Zoom, please ask questions at any point. But today's is really geared towards having a more discussion base. So yeah, we're gonna now go ahead and introduce the panel. Anybody want to start first?
Sure, I can go. And I think, Monique, are you in a cafe? Maybe put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, because there's been sounds like people are having a party on a Monday at 1 o'clock. Oh my goodness. They must have a real reason to celebrate. So I'm Adonia Lugo. I am, as Rio said, part of the Untokening and People for Mobility Justice and Pueblo. And I'm actually joining this webinar from my office at Antioch University, Los Angeles, where I teach in urban sustainability. And it's been great being part of this series as we have tried out having some engagement with the Untokening community between our in-person convenings, which have been going on every fall since 2016. And I think we have learned a lot about what works and gotten some good pointers for how we can do things differently in a second iteration. And it's been really fun getting to create a space where people can explore some of the current issues happening around mobility and mobility justice. So that'll be my intro.
Hi, everyone. My name is Monique Lopez with Pueblo. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, hopefully there's not too much noise in the background. It's been a real pleasure working with this team. I'm also located in Los Angeles as well, and helping more with the logistical piece of these discussions, and also helping with the creative piece as well in terms of brainstorming with these two lovely people on what potential discussions could happen in this space as well. So thank you all for continuing to be engaged in this space, and we look forward to hearing your feedback as we continue this discussion.
Awesome. I can go ahead now and introduce myself. Hey, everybody. Again, my name is Río Oxas. I use they, them, their pronouns. As stated, I'm with PMJ. I'm now the Building Power Director. And I was particularly excited about this webinar because of how sometimes our work can feel siloed. I think I'm really privileged to work with People for Mobility Justice because we can come together and talk about some of these bigger issues together. But I do know that across the nation, like, you know, I saw some folks like kind of being siloed out, but still having those great provoking thought, you know, coming questions come up and flourish anytime I got to go to conferences and whatnot. And in bringing it all into this one space was just really exciting to me. And one of the other things I wanted to share about why this webinar was important was some of these conversations are really just tough, right? Like they're just really difficult, they're really challenging. And it's nice to be in a place where you can just literally kind of like put off whatever professional hat, whatever other hat you were wearing to just kind of talk more frankly. And that's kind of what I was hoping in creating and co-creating these spaces, was just a more frank conversation. And I also just want to thank so much Monique at Pueblo, who's just such an incredible organizer and did so much of the logistics and tech stuff. And then Adonia and all her amazing connects and visioning. I just had such a great time. I definitely hope to keep this trio going. I like I said, like they know, I'm a fan of this trio. So it's been really amazing to see what we've developed. Cool. So we are now moving on to overview of Transformative Talks and Family Tea Time. So I'll give a quick synapses of the two differences. So for Transformative Talks, one of the things we really wanted it to be was something more like this, which is very open, broadcast as far and wide as we possibly could go. And so that's kind of the focus in Transformative Talks. And so we thought about, okay, well, there was a lot of thought, just so everybody knows, a lot of thought of like which topics that we wanted to engage people deserve like a wide broadcast, right? And so we'll do the synapses of those first, and then at a deeper level, we also had family tea time, where we limited the capacity usually to about 25 people, and we prioritize people with, more marginal identities, I would say. So, Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer folks, trans folks, LGBTQI, etc. That was really who we wanted to focus. And the family tea times, in a nutshell, was really about creating a space, a very safe space, right? And by that, I mean that, it was confidential. And so it's one of the reasons why we didn't put out recordings and we did more notes, is we just wanted to keep it confidential so that people could potentially troubleshoot some things that were going on in their own organization, in their own cities, so that we could come together as heads for each other and support each other. So building that really, like, I guess that cyber support system, right, in essence. So I wanted to give that as context, but Monique and Adonia, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else for that piece before we go into kind of recapping what we went through this first season.
I'll just share a little bit. Thanks, Rio. I'm just, reflecting back upon like when we were first engaging in a discussion about what the space can and should look like. We all very much, as Rio mentioned, believed in the importance of breaking down these silos, but also creating a space that is a space of support, because a lot of us are sometimes the only one or two or three individuals in our different organizations or different agencies in which we're a part of. And we're continually in this struggle for justice, or just even helping push the narrative a little bit further within those entities we're a part of. And it's quite exhausting to feel alone and be alone in those spaces. And so we wanted to really create a space in which the Untokening has helped do with their annual gatherings, but also create a virtual space that could serve and be a safe space for the community, and a space of healing, and a space of learning, and a space to uplift each other, where it's centering Black, Indigenous, queer, trans, people of color in this space, that could happen and be sprinkled throughout the year. And so that we wouldn't have to like refuel our souls only once a year, but we have opportunities to fill our souls together in this space periodically, and then reconnect in person. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to join the last Untokening in person, but I'm looking forward to the next one that's coming up, and I'll be joining that for sure, because there's been people that we've met and faces that we've seen in this space that I'm just looking forward to connecting in person as well. So for us, the space has really been an extension of the Untokening physical space, and a space where we can grow together, challenge each other, but also learn from each other, and help define in our own terms best practices, so to speak, right? And not just best practices in terms of technical best practices, but and Rio and Adonia will speak more about this, but best practice in terms of spiritual best practices in these spaces as well. So I really appreciate the Untokening for both seeing the need, but also willing to help fund this space, because I think it has served, I could just speak for myself, but for myself, served as a really beautiful and necessary space, and I think other people probably feel the same way as well.
Yeah, any thoughts from you, Adonia? Any overarching ones before we get into the just kind of going? Awesome. So how would you all like to do this? Should we go chronological from the first one, from the first TT all the way to the present? Would that make the most sense in doing that?
Yeah, let's do chronological.
Okay, Cool. So yeah, I just, again, as a reminder, and maybe all of you who are on this call, or not this call, this Zoom, didn't get to see all of them. So we wanted to give just a short synapse of each one that we did. And again, just so that you all know, part of the reason why we want to do this summary and kind of this remembering is because we do have questions for all of you in how, you know, how to continue to make this space a productive space, right? So kind of like, you know, riffing off what Monique just talked about it being a uplifting place, a place where we can like heal with each other, kind of give us that feedback, like, could we do it and could we improve more? So I'll begin. The first one that we did was called, I think this was really important to me, that the first one we kicked it off with was the queer, trans, intersex, Black, Indigenous people of color in bike medicine. I think that's really phenomenal of how, you know, the trio here, we decided to just focus on this, you know, on our communities that are really intersecting, and also really highlight all the work that queer, trans folks of color have been doing in the work of bike advocacy and transportation mobility for a long time, and who still have I've sensed we have a really high representation amongst mobility justice advocates, which I think is amazing, right? And so we kicked it off with Sarah, who is from Black Freedom Outfitters and Red Green Atlanta. And I'm trying to, Jesse Harris, who's now joined PMJ as the Inspiring Growth Manager. Tez de la Tierra, who's actually working at Cycles of Change in Oakland. And then we have Landis Pulido, who is based out currently in New Mexico, but was doing work in Washington, D.C. with particularly youth of color and bikes work. So we kind of focused specifically on how bikes, I think what was amazing, what came out of that conversation for me, was to remember how literally for some of us, bikes was what saved us, right? Like what prevented, even for some of us, like suicidality, massive depression, etc. And then also just like literally economic freedom. Like that's, I think at the baseline of the themes that emerged from that one was just both of those, that economic freedom and that mental and spiritual well-being that came with literally just picking up a bike and sitting on a saddle and living your life that way. So that's a little bit, a snippet of that. And I think there's a recording out there that you can check out. All right, then I'll pass it on to Adonia for the one in October.
Great, yeah. So I put a link in the chat box to the Untokening websites page where we have archived information about all the different transformative talks and family tea times. And there you can see links to all of the recordings of the transformative talks. So in October, we had a conversation about new mobility and mobility justice. And I was joined by Dr. Do Lee, who is based in New York, who is an environmental psychologist who has done work on mobility justice, and also Dr. Mimi Scheller, who is based at Drexel University in Philadelphia, where she's the director of the Center for Mobility's Research and Policy. And Dr. Scheller had a book that came out last year called Mobility Justice. And so she is one of the premier scholars in the interdisciplinary field of mobilities, who has been working on the academic side to articulate the kinds of injustices and projects toward mobility justice that folks around the country and world are working on. And so in that conversation, we talked about some different themes relating to new kinds of mobility services that have been developing in the last few years, such as e-bikes, and how these technologies on their own tend to play out in the same social relations of inequality that are already embedded into our urban planning and urban transportation systems. And so we talked about ways of disrupting those relations of inequality and putting a focus on building new social infrastructures or social networks alongside new tech mobility systems. So so that one has the video posted. And then the following month in November, we did a intro to the untokening convening that was going to be happening just a few days after that transformative talks. So it was called What is the Untokening? And on that, I was joined by Renee Rivera, who is one of the Untokening core organizers, and Naomi Dorner, who's another Untokening co-founder, and Heather Nugent, who was the lead organizer of Untokening Detroit, which happened in November of 2018. And so that's a good one to check out the recording of if you're curious to learn more about what is the untokening, what are the principles of mobility justice, which is our core resource we created in 2017, and different pieces there. And then we took a break for the winter and came back with, let's see, was the next transformative talk organizing new mobility workers? Yeah, I think it was. So that was a conversation that I helped organize in March that brought together some projects that are focused on the labor side of the mobility piece. So there is a good number of years of history now of folks who have organized bike share workers. And so we had David Kelman and Dolly Winter, who had both been involved in having bike share workers join the Transportation Workers United Union, TWU, in DC, New York City, and I think Dolly was also involved in organizing in Chicago. And then we had them in conversation with Alexandra Carbone from Rideshare Drivers United, which is an emerging group that has chapters around the country that is working to organize, you guessed it, rideshare drivers. So people who work for Uber and Lyft and who are finding that their needs as workers are not at the fore in that mobility space. So in that conversation, we learned a little bit about the basics of forming unions, learned about some of the priorities and the challenges of organizing in workspaces like rideshare, where people don't see each other. You don't go to a shared workspace the way you do in a lot of conventional professions. So the gig economy presents different challenges to having workers find a common cause. That was something that David really emphasized, that the starting point for a union is just being in conversation with some of your coworkers and recognizing that you have a shared cause in organizing together. So Rideshare Drivers United, RDU, has been coming up with some really interesting ways of meeting that challenge, and already has been able to create a rideshare drivers list of demands based on the feedback that they've gotten from the drivers in their network. So that was our March conversation, and I think that's it from me on the transformative talks. Did I miss any of them?
No, I think you got them all.
Great. So family tea times, travel back in time to September. Monique, do you want to tell us about the background for creating the first family tea time, a resilient response to gaslighting?
Sure, thanks, Adonia. So this is one that that I had been really reflecting upon, having come out of a recent experience at the time, experiencing gaslighting and having conversations with other people of color who both work in nonprofit space and who also work in agency space as well. And there was a really great article that I had read that came out around that same time from Helen Kim Ho, and who talked about gaslighting, but also talked about essentially institutional racism within these different nonprofit spaces. And so, and that particular article, and having read it, really provided me a lot of comfort and peace of mind, and like, oh, I am not crazy in this space. This actually happens to people, and particularly people of color, in these spaces. And so it acknowledged my experience and provided a lot of validity. So I reached out to her. It was a long shot. And she was definitely willing to and interested in being part of this first family tea time conversation, which was really centered around healing, but also centered around specific strategies when these issues come up, what you can do about it, and how you can have allies support you in that. I wasn't able to actually facilitate that family tea time. My baby was born the day that was happening. So Adonia had stepped in to facilitate that conversation. And I'll let Adonia share more on what was said during that day and some of the key lessons learned.
Great. Yeah, so it was really fun getting to step in there and co-facilitate with Helen Kim Ho. She is a really great civil rights advocate based in the South. And she had written, this really great piece that circulated a lot early in 2018. And so it was wonderful just learning more about the background that led to her creating this piece of advice about getting beyond tokenism in nonprofits. And one thing I learned from that conversation was that the term gaslighting comes from an old Hollywood movie in which somebody is being, tricked about something. And I still haven't actually seen the film, but I had no idea that that's where the term came from. So we put together a summary of that conversation that you can get to from the untokening.org/webinars page. And this is a model that we'll be using for the other family tea times as well, where we sum up some of the key themes that emerged and then name some tools for untokening that came up on the talk, and then advice for people who want to be accomplices for change, even if they themselves don't identify as being members of marginalized communities. And so the key themes from that conversation were a few different folks on the call shared that, they had seen their perspectives rejected if their ideas were not seen as bringing profit immediately to some project. So the economic argument that often gets made for why, trying something new or bringing in different ideas is, bad for the bottom line. So that was a topic of conversation. There was also conversation around false allies. So people who you think are going to be supportive or understand where you're coming from, who are actually still operating in a fairly individualistic mode. So that can be an issue for folks who are in workplaces where they're an only, or where there's very few others who come from a similar kind of experience. And I saw there was a question about the article that Helen wrote in 2018, and then the asker found the article, but I'd be happy to share it in the chat box as well. The article was called 8 Ways People of Color Are Tokenized in Nonprofits, and I'm going to go ahead and just paste it into the chat box here. Great, so the next family tea time that we had was in October, and that was, Rio, did you facilitate that one?
Yep, so that was really special to me. We wanted to have somebody talk about decolonizing urban planning and design, and I think that in of itself, that title is really powerful. And as we were speaking about it, what came to fruition was, Sandra de la Loza, who was intervening in various ways in how to decolonize urban planning. And a lot of the ways that Sandra really approaches that is through, social practice. I think they call it like social art practice, where it's like, how do artists literally go into the streets to engage and change the shape of the infrastructure in the streets, right? And there's a variety of ways you can do that are really creative. And so we thought, hey, why don't we bring an artist and not an urban planner to think about this? And I think that was really powerful on our part to make that move. And you can definitely check out Sandra de la Loza's work. Like, she's just really well known around the social justice art practice field. And so bringing her on was just one, she really shared her heart with us, you know, and so some of the things I'll share are kind of big lessons learned. And I know it was a really powerful space for people because she was speaking things that maybe people felt in their heart but couldn't put words to it, right? And I think that that's important, you know, and I'll list some of the high level kind of things that we learned in that process. So one of them, and she's all about this, even as like a friend of mine, I'm really a mentor of mine, talking about how do we combat erasure, right? And so she actually started this collective called the Pocho Research Institute, you know, and it's very much about how we ourselves become researchers for our own community because we are being locked out. Our histories are being locked out from ourselves. So how do we make that history physically present and reclaiming spaces so that we're not being washed out, you know, and how do we continue to capture narratively? So even the act of these webinars and recording it is a way we combat erasure, right? So we can talk about this so that way 20 years from now, folks who are in urban planning or in city government or whatever, they can refer to us to be like, oh wait, they're still, hopefully not, but probably still dealing with the same things, right? Because that is what has happened, right? And historically that gets erased so much. So a lot of her artwork is really about finding, even amidst like very slanted capitalistic research out there, finding the nuggets of how to not erase our own history. And with that, literally knowing where we come from and knowing how this infrastructure was built, right? And so a lot of the times we think that it just happened. Even bureaucrats often think that, well, it's bureaucracy, that's the process. And it's like, the process is made by humans. You know, there was a way that got there and humans can unmake that process, right? And I think that was really important. It's just, how do you know that history of where it came? And the big one that she most recently did that is intersecting with transportation justice or mobility justice is her To Oblivion exhibit. It's an art exhibit talking about the ending of what was known there as the kind of the light rail that was happening in LA in the 1940s, 60s, in that time, which was like one of the best in the world, and kind of like the decay of that and where that was sourced from, which was rooted actually in real estate development, right? And so thinking about that context and knowing that context and how that impacts us as, you know, folks who are planning or advocating in urban settings. And then moving from radical rhetoric to relevance. And this is important because today, a lot of what we're seeing that's happening among city government officials is the potentially and likely the cooptation of words like equity and justice and, you know, anti-racism even. All these words that are being kind of taken and sometimes being sold back to us in maybe a little bit wonky way. You know, I'm not saying that everybody's getting it wrong out there, but sometimes it's just words that are being taken, and now it makes actually racism really harder to see because it becomes more and more subliminal. And unless you have like a keen sense of critical analysis, which our educational system is not designed to do, then you'll miss it, right? The sellout or locked out, again, this idea of like, oh, if we enter the institutions, you know, we're selling out. And then at the same time, you know, my mentor has always pushed me to be like, even though she's really, if anybody has seen her work, she's very much radical, kind of, you know, very anarchist style in that way, but also acknowledging that if we're not at the table, we're just going to be completely left out in those discussions, right? So in what ways can we be creative intervening? And then the last one, which I think to me was the most powerful, was her recommendation to all of us to build your social infrastructure first, right? So that being more important than worrying about like what infrastructures to build to community is how am I building my social infrastructure first, my support system, my networks. And this Transformative Talks is part of that for me, and I think for a lot of us, right? So I wanted to share that. And then I'll move forward to the next one, which was mind mapping your footprint with Olivia Chumacero, who's an elder of mine. Check out her work at Everything is Medicine. It's a blog, WordPress. And she really, you know, in a nutshell, she really was asking us to think about literally our lives in a detailed way, like being able to map toothpaste, for example, and where it came from, like mapping it so far back to like the extraction, the movement, the making, the warehouses, the people, and how much it took just to get to that toothpaste, right? And And really saying all that to say, you know, in that global economy, because it probably came from multiple places in the world just for you to get your toothpaste, how do we go back to the land? How do we return back to native flora and fauna? Like, that's a really big push, right? And that in and of itself would impact our designs of cities and mobility in such a positive way when we start refocusing on what's here. And what's here right now is we are in Tongva land. We forgot to say that at the beginning. We are in Tongva land, and LA County also has the Toviam and Chumash people as well. And so a lot for her was like really understanding that and building a relationship with the local flora and fauna, which is still recommended to do. She also talked about just kind of the morning time of Thanksgiving that a lot of indigenous people have, and it'll be in the write-up, but just to give some high level stuff. And yeah, and then that's just a little bit in a nutshell, both of those, which, you know, meant a lot to me personally. I'll now pass it on to Monique.
Thank you so much, Rio. And I hope that folks are seeing too, like, even though these are like separated, like, or different conversations, there's just so much overlap with all the talks we helped facilitate the past 9 months. And this one here that I'm going to talk about is no different. We had a family tea time that really talked about and really uplifted the importance of community-based organizations collaborating and partnering, or actually agencies collaborating and partnering with community-based organizations, and the importance behind that, because community-based organizations are closely linked to the communities in which they are a part of, and so they are able to, one, effectively communicate, but also facilitate conversations that are based upon years and years of trust. And so the importance of agencies working with community-based organizations. But what many of us who have been part of those processes have found is that there's still very much white supremacy culture that is a part of these organizations that do not provide for the best and healthiest working relationships between community-based organizations and the agencies, or even the best trusting and working relationships with the community themselves. And so a few of the things that the folks on that discussion highlighted, who we had Renee Estrada with Public Matters, and we also had Anisha. Could you help me in pronouncing her last name? I don't want to mispronounce it. I couldn't hear you, Adonia.
Hingorani.
Ingorani, thank you so much, from People for Mobility Justice, shared their knowledge in going through those experiences, and were able to collectively identify key elements that sometimes happen as part of these processes. So where they highlighted that community trauma cannot be met with transactional planning, meaning that many times these processes, the agency is like, we have a budget, do your job, and but fail to realize that the community is dealing with years of community trauma in terms of how agencies or how governments have treated individuals within those communities as well. And so ensuring that there's a different way of doing planning that builds upon trust, and that has a timeline for a project that also allows for that trust building and that relationship building to happen. And really focusing on that the trust gap can only be closed with sincere relationship building, and really having the community-based organization take the lead in that particular relationship building. Again, here, similar to some previous family tea times and transformative talks, is the importance of fighting erasure in these spaces. What oftentimes happens is that there will be a community planning process where the community-based organizations and communities were involved in that, and there's a history of struggle even going through that process. But with everybody still remaining at the table, there's also a process of healing. But oftentimes what happens is that these narratives of the struggle in the process and the pushing that the community-based organizations did to bring the agencies on board to having a more just and equitable plan and framework, that is often scrubbed out and erased from these actual narratives or in the actual planning documents. So ensuring that those narratives of those struggles of helping push the agency beyond what it's used to doing as business as usual is really important in including in those conversations, because what happens when those narratives are scrubbed out is that the next time there's another planning process, there's no acknowledgement of that struggle, and it's almost like you're starting square one with the agency instead of moving and building from that particular place where you were able to reach in the last planning process. And then very quickly too is the importance of solidarity and being transparent and engaging in healthy communication often. So in terms of the importance of solidarity is in a lot of these processes, there's these unequal power dynamics. The agency holds the money, holds a lot of what is said or not said in these plans, and so it's really important that the different community-based organizations or community members that are part of these processes, that they remain in solidarity to collectively help leverage the power that they hold alongside with community members to help move the agency towards a more just and equitable planning process. And then lastly, the importance of transparent and engaged healthy communication is really key throughout the entire process, given that there's an acknowledgement that going through these processes, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, but it's important to communicate expectations up front, both the agency and the community-based organizations and communities as well, and have those conversations early and often in order to ensure that the community voice is ultimately included in whatever is planned and whatever is implemented moving forward.
Yeah. Am I on? I am on mute. Great. Yeah. And building off that, I think what was really great is that, and I don't even think we thought about it so clearly, but in tandem, we organized the community engagement piece. And then right after that, the Black, Indigenous, people of color in government. And in government, and we call it healing relationships and trust, right? And I think that was really important that we did that, because, you know, I know that for people for mobility justice and even for the untokening, and I know for Pueblo, it's really important to us that critical consciousness is not only raised at the community level, because we already believe the community has that critical analysis. Like we already believe that, we know that. But what's hard sometimes is that some folks in government agency may not have that, right? And part of it is that myopic lens that happens when you get institutionally trained, so you can be pipelined into these very institutions, right? So some of that is just kind of quote unquote the miseducation that happens to people. So for us, it is important to engage people in that conversation so that we can build that critical consciousness of what mobility justice is. But also for those folks that are coming from our communities that already have that background, how do we support them to get in there and stay in there as well? Because we also see the importance of it being a very much a full horizontal, full-fledged, like we have to do it in all means necessary to get mobility justice, which does include being at the institution, doing some grassroots, like classic organizing and all this stuff in between. Like we really believe that, right? And which is why it was great to have community engagement and then have, you know, government. And in that conversation, Sumi Gant, who's, you know, an elder and a board member for PMJ, is now a consultant to many government agencies actually, but was working in government for like 30 plus years. We also had Maria Sapin, who's working at an Oregon state agency and is an urban planner and also sits at PMJ's board. And then Heather Northover, who works at the LA County Public Health Department, even the Health Equity Center. And so in that conversation, I think some of the things that really were emerging for us is the struggles and the isolation that a lot of folks, and in this case, 3 women of color, are facing within working in the agencies, right? And a lot of the issues of even just like watching what they're saying, like, oh, I have to be careful about what I'm saying, filtering, censoring, all that kind of issues that were coming up. And then also feeling that being kind of a rock and a hard place, right? Because feeling like, okay, the institution is having a hard time valuing me or is tokenizing me, right? Either or, both of them are problematic. And now the community sees me as a sellout. And so I'm trying to do work for the community, but hey, community doesn't really want to engage me because they don't trust me. and which is why we put trust as one of those levels. So part of, in a synapse is there's going to be a thorough report on this. It's just thinking about like, okay, how do we heal? What does that healing look like between community and folks in government, but also what does it look like for folks to heal in government, right? So Sumi talked a lot about just doing meditation every day and everybody's own personal self-care practices. How do we rebuild that relationship, with community and government? And then again, just what does it look like to build trust with government? And one of the biggest takeaways that I took from the three of them is they kept talking about how we go to community, not because it's like what pays me, it's because that's what it really feels like it is to be responsible to communities, me going there and engaging and constantly and not waiting for people to come to us, but me going all the time to where are they so that they know that I care enough to go to their meetings and to their tables all the time. So I think that was just kind of like some high overarching pieces there. Cool. So I think that covers all our family tea times, which again, were really powerful, and you'll get is summaries of it, but we hope to continue that in the future. At this point, I'll pass it over to Monique to, in a nutshell, be able to share kind of the plans for the report that everybody will have access to. And then we do want to open it up to discussions, which again, please, in the Zoom chat box, add your questions, or if you want to raise your hand and kind of chime in via live, we'd also appreciate that. But yeah, Monique, I'll hand it over to you for the plans for report.
Yeah, and I'll try to be very, very brief. So essentially with the report, we're going to have the summaries of the family tea times and a short summary of each transformative talk that you all can look at and also use as a resource moving forward as well. But also acknowledging that this was an experimental space for all of us in creating community online and conversations online. And so we also want to help document some of that process as well. So that if moving forward, we have a foundation to start with in terms of like the more logistical pieces that are necessary in facilitating these types of spaces as well, and those types of pieces as well. And then also, if folks are interested in helping engage moving forward, we have a good little guidebook, or maybe like not a guidebook, but like 1 or 2 sheets that provides good guidance on how to do that and get other people plugged in more easily moving forward. Because much of the bulk of the work behind the scenes was essentially figuring out these different logistical functions or things we needed to do in order to engage in these conversations. And so we'll have that documented as well, and as well like what the budget was in terms of moving this piece forward as well. But also in thinking about and what we'd like to incorporate in this, and I'll pass this over to the next person that's facilitating this, is that we brought to the table individuals and organizations and conversations that based upon our own understanding and point of reference and our own relationships, we'd also love to be informed by our network as terms in terms of like what types of conversations are needing to be had in these types of spaces, and then who are the individuals as well, or organizations or entities doing that work that could be help facilitate those conversations moving forward as well. So we'd like to also help kind of document some of that for potential season 2 moving forward. So I'm gonna pass it on to the person who's facilitating that part of the conversation. Is that Adonia?
I think Rio was going to facilitate the discussion questions, but I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, if you want to do it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So some of our questions that we have been thinking about are, how did the format of the Transformative Talks webinars versus the Family Tea Times RSVP required spaces, how did we like did we think that was successful in terms of creating the more intimate feel that we wanted with the Family Tea Times? So do either of you have thoughts on that?
And by either, we're including everybody on this call right now, correct? We're trying to get everybody.
Yeah. If that's, yep. So anybody who participated in the Transformative Talks versus Family Tea Times, curious to hear feedback on that. I can say from my view as a facilitator, I mainly facilitated Transformative Talks, and let's see. We had a good number of questions with the different topics, and always ended with a feeling of, oh, there could have been more to say. So it did seem like having that more open space was a good what's the word? It brought the untokening to a wider audience. And I only facilitated one family tea time, so I don't have as much of a sense of the different way that felt that some of our other hosts would have.
I'll just add one thing for the family tea time format in particular, which was the more like intimate, closed conversations, not public conversations. One thing that I saw in trying to organize those is that the facilitators who were part of those discussions felt safer to share.
Oh yeah.
And share more intimate levels of detail in that space, knowing that space was a more intimate and closed space. So I think it allowed the freedom for people to be more vocal, and also to share tools and experiences with less fear. And so I really valued that space. Some of the tea times we had like wait lists of overflowing people. I wish we could have gotten more people in, but I think it was just really important and valuable to keep that more intimate, not only for the folks that were on there, but also for the facilitators as well, to provide that safe space for them, which is also necessary.
Yeah, any things from the audience? And again, you can also, if you're feeling shy to talk, you could also chime in via the chat box, because we'd really like to get your input. We really value that, which is why we decided to spend one of our webinars on this specifically.
I'll speak up. My name is Cameron Gray. I work with a nonprofit in Santa Barbara called Community Environmental Council. And I actually just found out about this. It's the first transformative talk that I've been able to listen in on. Jennifer Hernandez Munoz sent me the notice about it. So I just wanted to say hi, and also ask how you've gotten the word out about these conversations. I'm just curious kind of what the plans are in the future to continue them as well.
I can take that question. So we've primarily gotten the word out with our untokening mailing list. So you can find that you can sign up at untokening.org. And then also through each of our social media web pages. So People for Mobility Justice, Pueblo, and then also Untokening, both on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of the above. And that's primarily how we've shared this. And then people, of course, word of mouth has been really instrumental in terms of for seasons 2. I think also Adonia shared on the Bike Equity Network, which she facilitates. For season 2, we're definitely open to suggestions in other spaces that would be good to share these conversations. And so we'd love to hear from folks regarding what those spaces could be.
So as folks are thinking about that, we can go ahead and talk about what some of the co-hosts thought were highlights of the series. And I wanted to get to that question because something that I think really stood out to me about the series that I hadn't understood as much beforehand was the realities of the, let's say, specificity of the different professional spaces that folks are working in. So from the get-go, the untokening model has been to organize and build relationships among people with a lived experience being part of marginalized communities who in some way are engaged with transportation and mobility. So usually the catch-all I use is to say advocacy, planning, or policy. So you're involved as an activist, you're involved because you are a planner, you're involved because you're a public servant. Somehow you're engaged with this spectrum of how people move and how we do governance and development and regulation around how people move. And one thing I found through the Transformative Talks series is that if you work in government, you're having a particular kind of conversation, and sometimes it's good to be able to talk to your peers in that institutional space. If you work for a planning firm, then you're having a specific kind of conversation. And there are major differences between large planning firms that have offices in every big city versus smaller planning firms that are really focused on a particular region. And then if you're in a community-based organization or coming more from the grassroots activism side, you're in a conversation that has its own specificity as well. So I really liked the way that the family tea times that happened in 2019 highlighted some of the conversation happening in those specific kinds of spaces. And I'm definitely interested in seeing how the Transformative Talks series can continue to maybe build out some specific peer cohorts of folks who are looking for a common thread in the workspace.
I was just going to say, Adonia, I really appreciate you uplifting that about the cross-sectoral experiences and cross-sectoral approach to transformative talks and family tea time. And I think for myself, is it helped me develop a greater sense of empathy for folks in different sectors that sometimes we're just like, why is this not happening, or what are the, I just not being able to see what's going on the other side of things has for myself helped create a better sense of empathy and better understand some of the challenges folks are facing. And then from my side of things, like what can we do proactively to one, mitigate or prevent those things from happening moving forward. And so I really appreciate you uplifting that.
Yeah, and I can piggyback on that, and just one other thing that I thought was really amazing was literally having people from across the country coming and converging around this topic. I think that's just really powerful to see the ways in which, whether we're in different regions and different like cultural pockets, like a lot of us are still facing the same issues because, it's the nature of the quote unquote, the USA government, right? So talking about that, I think was really powerful. And then just having a lot of love for the work, like in hearing that in every panelist, like every single panelist came on to this webinar with sharing their love of this work, even amidst its incredible challenges. So that's really awesome to always get reminded and grounded in that.
Great. So we are getting close to time here. So as a wrap up, what topics do you two or others on the call think would be coming up as potential topics for future conversation?
I can go. I definitely want to continue building on, like riffing on like a second version of BIPOC in government. I thought that was just a really special and powerful one. The other one I would like to see is even having like, at least in the context of LA, but even in the context of anywhere in the country, is local indigenous folks talking about what they think of quote unquote urban planning, right? And what does that look like in the context of with us being in their ancestral land, and us even as advocates who are not of the ancestral land making choices around what cities, parks, whatever, et cetera, should look like. So those two are kind of probably my high priority ones.
Yeah, and likewise, I really would love to learn from folks and really be in a space where we're defining along with indigenous peoples how can we take a decolonial approach to planning and even policy development, and so coming up with those strategies collectively and holding ourselves as a community accountable to moving forward in that way. Because oftentimes, and which we need these spaces for that too, but we talk about the challenges and issues that we're facing, but how do we build the new collectively together, and the new that's just and doesn't continue to erase peoples that have been here. And then the second thing too is to still carve out a space for healing, which I think is incredibly important in our work, and that we don't necessarily do enough of. And so however that looks like in manifesting is how do we continue to build into the space intentional healing and collective healing as well moving forward.
And some topics that I think it would be great to continue to expand on are around how to enact untokening conversations in your local or regional context. I got to be part of a really cool conversation in Chicago a few weeks ago, where there's a circle of folks who have been thinking together about the principles of mobility justice and wanting to move forward with a local vision for mobility justice. I think this would be a great space to help folks do that kind of building. I also think that there's really good potential to talk about what just transition looks like in the mobility justice space. That's increasingly a model that folks around the country are using. And we haven't really had an explicit conversation about it with untokening. So I think that would be fun to talk about. So anybody who wants to send us some ideas or feedback, feel free to reach out to rio@mobilityjustice.org or any of us, and you'll get your idea in. And any final thoughts from the other panelists?
I'll just share a reflection I had this week. So last week I was at the American Planning Association conference, and I sat in to listen to a panel discussion, and somebody from an agency cited the mobility justice principles that the untokening collectively developed, and that have really helped use to frame a lot of these transformative talks moving forward. And through the citing of it, they acknowledged that their agency isn't there, but they want to work towards being there. And this is someone who, I didn't know isn't necessarily plugged into the network, but we can see the more we talk about these things, the more we don't allow ourselves to be erased in these spaces and record and document these things, it's going to start to permeate into various institutions. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that, or just even the conversation around that, to start to take root in what is very much a mainstream space that doesn't have these types of conversations, that essentially historically even today dismisses these types of conversations. So I just want to share that little story and say kudos to everybody that's helped facilitate this, but also others that are in this space with us today and who have been in this space with us the past 9 months and beyond, because it's important that we continue to talk and document, and I see that is meaningful not only for ourselves, for our communities, but also for these institutions that are starting to acknowledge and start to make those shifts.
I think that's a pretty great closing. I don't have anything to add. So thank you all for joining us, and we're looking forward to figuring out how to keep this going. So have a great week. Have a great rest of April.
Yeah, and just again, if you're interested in doing season 2, please email me directly at rio@mobilityjustice.org, and that way we're kind of envisioning what let me know. But thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.